really I'm pleased, of course, we talk about the erosion of Canadian values and so forth. I think that's very important. I think it's absolutely true. But I think we need to go much farther. If we look at the pattern of this government culminating in this bill, I think we need to talk about a creeping fascism in this country. I don't use that term lightly. I'm using the research that was done by Dr. Lawrence Britt in 2003, who examined Hitler's Germany, Mussolini's Italy, Franco's Spain, and Suharto's Indonesia, came up with 14 characteristics of a fascist regime. And I'm just going to read 7 of them for which this government qualifies eminently, and many more, but not so clearly. Powerful and continuing nationalism, identification of enemies, scapegoats as a unifying cause, supremacy of the military, obsession with national security, which is what we're talking about here, and a couple more, labor power is suppressed, and obsession with crime and punishment. Now these are all features that this government manifests enormously. My question is, do you think we should be upping the ante and talk about a rising fascism in Canada?
Thank you for your question. And yeah, I think all of those points that you hit apply to our government. And as you were speaking, I was reminded of Canadians kind of during the anti-apartheid movement, and they were able to speak out about that. Under this new bill, that actually could be interpreted as supporting terrorism. Similarly, if you have strong feelings about Palestine or the Ukraine and have opinions that are different than your government, then that also could fall under these speech crimes or the threat to free speech. And so I think, yeah, in my opinion, I would agree with your statement.
Now we have an open letter signed by 4 former prime ministers, 5 former Supreme Court justices, 3 former ministers of justice, 4 former public safety ministers, and 3 former members of the Security Intelligence Review Committee, which is the CSIS review agency that the government likes to call robust. Okay? That's a pretty impressive list of people from all parties, who have said this bill is a danger to the fight against terrorism and to our civil liberties both. And I think that should cause the government to step back. New Democrats, of course, voted against it. I will give a shout out to the Green Party, who also voted against it. The Liberals and the Conservatives both supported the bill. I will also say, the Public Safety Committee, Elizabeth May has asked to be able to take a seat at the committee during the hearings on this, and the NDP is supporting that request, although we doubt that it will be allowed. And so it's a quirk in the House of Commons rules that that's one thing that you can't have closure of the debate on. You can talk as long as you like about how many witnesses and when, because normally there's not much to say about that. And so we found, on the first day in camera, we found 7 hours of things to say about that. And the Conservatives got more and more irritated. Their original offer, I'll be very frank with you, that was in camera. It's since been leaked, so everyone knows. It was 3 meetings, and to allow the official opposition to call 6 witnesses on this bill, 6. So we just simply said we're going to be here a very long time. And we said, we'll meet your deadlines. If you say it's necessary to finish these by Easter, we'll meet that. And as Murray already said, we went out in public and said we'll meet in the evenings, we'll meet on weekends, we'll meet during the constituency break weeks, because we think the most important thing is to have full and complete airing of what's in this bill so the public knows what the government is doing. And the Conservatives said no. So once the debate broke out in public, and I'm not allowed to talk about how that happened, but the committee meetings started taking place in public, the Conservatives then found themselves in a bit of a pickle. If they didn't offer more, they were going to look really bad. So we were calling for 25 meetings. Now, why did we pick a number like that? Because that would allow for between 80 and 100 witnesses total, and our share of that would have been around 40 witnesses. And we already had 60 requests from groups and individuals with expertise on this bill who wanted to appear. It's not an unreasonable amount. When the first anti-terrorism bill was adopted in 2001, They heard 80 witnesses over 19 meetings. So not an unreasonable request at all. The Conservatives got so frustrated on Thursday, they simply adopted bully tactics. They ignored the rules, written rules of the House of Commons that say you can't call the question on this. The chair, who's a very honorable Conservative, ruled against them. They challenged the chair, overruled the chair, broke the rules of the House of Commons, and went ahead and said we're going to have the 8 days of hearings, which results in about 14 witnesses for us. So a small victory, I would say, for the public, in that we'll hear a few more voices. And we've appealed to the Speaker today to say, how can a committee ignore the written rules of the House of Commons? It's the bully tactics and the lack of respect for parliamentary democracy in its most extreme form that we've seen in this Parliament. The rules don't matter. We won. We have a majority. We'll do what we like. And the part that I think didn't hit the public was that then we were given 3 hours to submit our witnesses. Having not known how many we'd have, now we expected they might do this. We were relatively ready, but 3 hours. So on Thursday afternoon, you had to contact people, see if they're willing to appear, have their contact information, and have it all submitted by 6 p.m. Right? That's the kind of government this is, a bullying government. Now, I'm already going on too long. Let me talk about just some what's in the bill. Murray said I'll do it quickly. That's absolutely impossible. But there are some themes. The first theme that I talked about before is this bill is vague and has poorly defined concept throughout the bill. That should worry you. This is law we're talking about. Now, when the Minister of Justice was asked about the definition of terrorism, he said, we're not going to get bogged down in details.
Go look it up.
Go look it up, he said. Not ignoring the fact that this bill, of course, changes that for many things, but not for the criminal act of terrorism, but for almost everything else. So there's a new offense, and I'm sorry I'm being ironic tonight, but the new offense is a criminal offense to promote terrorism, and here's the legal term, in general. It actually says in general. What legal meaning could that possibly have? And the other problem with that, of course, is it's already illegal to promote specific acts of terrorism. So we've been asking the government to say, why this new offense? What is this? What does it do? A second example is that it now, in the bill, the government likes to talk about terrorism in public. In the bill, it talks about the security of Canada. So it shifts very subtly from terrorism, which everybody's against, and everybody can understand why you may need to do some things, to security of Canada, which includes infrastructure like pipelines, which includes financial and economic security, which includes a whole raft of things that are now laid out, that are now subject to surveillance, right? And possibly subject to detention. So a very serious concern throughout the bill is this very vague, very general kinds of things that are there. A second concern that runs through the bill is that it lowers the threshold for the government to act against citizens. So we've had fairly high standards for saying the government can't act against you unless it actually has things like evidence, right? And one of the lawyers I was talking about said, for some of these things, we have a standard of evidence that is about as low as you can imagine, and the government just lowered that. So I know some others will talk about this, but one of the things that's very worrying is it moves the definition for action from reasonable to believe something will take place to suspect that it might happen. Okay? You should all be very worried about that. Right? To suspect that it might happen is not a standard for which you can present evidence. But I think I need to stop for a minute because the government always says, CSIS has oversight. They do not. They have review. And it seems like a technicality, but here's a very important difference. Oversight is someone who in real time supervises what CSIS is doing because they do it in secret. And there was such a person called the Inspector General of CSIS until 2012. And that person reported to the minister and the director of CSIS, had access to all their files, all their documents, and was responsibility was to say, CSIS agents are obeying the law. The Conservatives eliminated that position. It's gone. There is no such position. And they say, well, CERC will take care of that, except that CERC has no capacity or ability to do real-time oversight, which is very important because it's secret things that are being done. And I'll have to say, when our public safety meeting went public, When it went on the air live, we received more than 200 calls in the first 2 hours in my office in Ottawa saying, keep going, we care about this. Because conservatives were saying, you're just going on and nobody in the public really cares about this, right? They just want us to do something about terrorism. And so, again, I'm very encouraged. And after this meeting, if you feel inspired, you have to let the government know that you are listening and you do know what they're up to in this one. Thanks very much.
Well, I'm so pleased to have Reg Whitaker with us. Professor Whitaker may be known to you. He's a national expert on this topic of national security. Emeritus Professor of York University, Adjunct Professor at the University of Victoria, co-author of a book entitled Secret Service, the first comprehensive history of political policing in Canada. Reg was an advisor to the O'Connor Commission on Mayor Arar, the inquiry into Mayor Arar, and he's advised the Commission of Inquiry into the Air India bombing issue. He is really an expert, and we're so grateful he lives right here in Victoria and came to give us a hand explaining it. Thanks so much, Reg.
When the government brought in Bill C-51, they were really saying, and in as many words they were saying, if we're going to give you more security, you're going to have to give up some of your liberties. That balance has to be changed. Now, when a government comes to you and says that they want extraordinary powers, that they want to sort of, redraw the line between the state and society, I think there's a number of questions that parliamentarians and the public should address to a government that's asking, making that kind of a request. When you look at the definitions of terrorism, and Randall's already spoken to this in the bill, they are not only overbroad, as lawyers like to say, they're vastly overbroad. They've extended way beyond terrorism to include almost anything that interferes, for example, with the economic or financial stability of Canada, that might affect their critical infrastructures, et cetera, and even when they're talking about terrorism, and again, Randall spoke about this, they talk about terrorism in general. I mean, this is, it's just to cover everything. It's kind of drift net fishing. So, okay, let's have better information sharing to combat terrorism. But what they've done is that they've opened it up in a way that destroys the basic privacy protections. Good reasons why your data that is picked up by one government department isn't allowed to talk to the database that another government department has on you, because in fact you don't want a 1984 society in which government knows everything about you. They've knocked down those barriers. And supposedly just for terrorism, but who knows what that could be used for. Stopping promotion of jihad on the internet, okay, that's got to be, everybody agree with that. You don't want to have that sort of thing going on. It's so broadly drawn, however, that it imperils the right of freedom of expression much more generally. CSIS is not a law enforcement agency, and this is very, very dangerous. But when you read what's actually in this, it is quite unbelievable. It is truly unbelievable. What they're saying is that they will go in secret to a judge, present the case in secret to a judge, no contrary opinions being offered, and if the judge agrees to provide them with this disruption warrant, they can do basically anything they want. Well, not anything. They're not allowed to torture, murder, rape. Well, I tell you, read the bill. That's what it says. But short of that, they can break the law, they can violate charter rights, and they already have a get-out-of-jail-free card from a judge to do this with impunity and in secret. And we won't even know, and the people who are the targets of this won't even know, because, there's absolutely nothing, no way of finding out what that is. Are there adequate safeguards in place to protect against abuse of these new powers, or potential abuse? Well, even the use of these new powers is pretty abusive in itself. Anyway, the answer to that is no. That what we see is the rapid acceleration of government security powers, not matched by any kind of oversight, review, and indeed by a marked deterioration of the capacity, even for the limited review that we've already had in place over the last 15 years. Will these new measures actually increase security? Will they be effective against terrorism? And I think the answer to that is very clearly no. The wildly overbroad definition of terrorism, by extending potentially to environmentalists, First Nations, peaceful protesters, and so on, which is a very serious risk here in this legislation.
You know, the most common question that I hear is this bill going to chill free speech and threaten legitimate activism in Canada? In particular, we're concerned the Conservatives will apply these new powers to First Nations, environmental activists who stand in the way of projects like Enbridge Northern Gateway and Kinder Morgan. I know that concern is what's brought a lot of you here tonight as well. As I said in Parliament, Grand Chief Stuart Phillip was arrested on Burnaby Mountain over the Kinder Morgan issue, and what new threats to privacy and liberty would he have faced if this bill had been law then? Well, to talk about some of these questions, we have an amazing activist who's worked everywhere from the United Nations Refugee Program in Uganda to community organizations right here in Victoria. She's now an instructor in social justice at the University of Victoria and a researcher into nonviolence, social movements, and collective actions. Ladies and gentlemen, Laurel Collins.
As Randall pointed out, it stops, and Reg as well, it stops at the kind of rape, torture, murder. Things that it could actually include and things that other national security agencies do in terms of disruption techniques are breaking and entering, smear campaigns. It's also hacking into computers and deleting or swiping, like kind of deleting everything on them. Draining bank accounts. So these are just some of the disruption techniques that are possible under this new bill. And then moving on to free speech. And so this bill actually introduces kind of a new speech crime, which is the advocating, kind of encouraging terrorism. And we do actually have speech crimes in Canada. The hate speech is a crime, but it's limited to public discourse. So this new kind of speech crime would be public and private, which becomes even more scary when you think about CSIS's new powers. And it's not only people who are intending to incite terrorism, it's also people who are, and this is the word from the bill, reckless in the outcome of their communications. Immediately after those kind of 9 things that constitute what undermines Canada's security, there's a little caveat that says that this doesn't include lawful protest, advocacy, dissent and self-expression, or artistic, yeah, exactly, artistic expression. And so the key word in there is lawful, because what unlawful dissent includes are sit-ins, marches without permits. If you think of the civil rights movements and how many of these really important moments were unlawful acts of civil disobedience, and all of these unlawful acts of civil disobedience can now be kind of put under CSIS's new powers. Also, wildcat strikes, so strikes that aren't according to traditional labor laws. So yeah, and then I want to add to that just the recently leaked RCMP documents and the kind of language that they're describing environmental activists and Indigenous activists. They're calling them violent Aboriginal extremists and anti-petroleum extremists or anti-Canadian petroleum extremists, which it kind of boggles the mind. They're lumping in nonviolent civil disobedience and people who are engaged in this kind of peaceful protesting with what undermines the security of Canada. And it's kind of terrifying. And then I also wanted to bring out a couple things from those leaked RCMP documents. If you have a chance, I think it's just 12 pages, take a look at it. It's titled something along the lines of Threats to Critical Infrastructure in Canada. And for the first thing is they kind of call into question the legitimacy of climate change, which is scary that the RCMP documents are doing this. And they also focus on northern BC and New Brunswick. And so specifically Indigenous communities who are fighting against pipelines, who are fighting against fracking. And they label those as hotspots for this threat to Canadian security. These bills are threatening that. They're actually undermining, first of all, who wants to be involved in collective action, because all of a sudden you are potentially going to be spied upon, potentially going to be detained without charge. It makes it much more risky for people to join in these actions. Then, if you actually do decide to, and you're building community with people, and you're afraid that maybe your friend is a CSIS agent, or that CSIS is planting agent provocateurs in your movement, it undermines that community that we're building. And then for the people who are on the front lines, and these are mainly Indigenous communities and environmental activists who are there risking that, putting themselves in danger, they are then going to be criminalized with this bill.
The question is, will the courts be backed into having no other alternative than to be charging people with criminal offenses?
There's a very good chance, and I think that she's right. Palmateer is right about the fact that there's going to be an intersection of the Aboriginal rights under Section 35 with the rights that are being abrogated in this bill. The problem, of course, is the judges are going to have to look at this with absolutely no evidence. You've heard Randall talk about the failure of evidence. A lot of the discussion is going to take place if we're targeting Aboriginal leaders in closed, without any lawyers for First Nations or others there. There's no special advocate. There's no lawyer, of course, by definition, there to look after the interests of anybody but the government, the CSIS. So it's hugely problematic. And I think another point is judges are going to be very resentful about the role we're asking them to play under this.
Well, I'm going to disagree with you. I think they are going to send somebody from CSIS. That's the point of the disruptive powers. So the disruptive powers are not about the actual criminal act of terrorism. They're about disrupting anything the government and CSIS perceives as a threat to the security of Canada. And so I know, being from Esquimalt, I've seen Raging Grannies doing lots of things in Esquimalt that the government might perceive to be a threat to the security of Canada. So under this bill, I'm not saying they'll have the resources, because I don't think they do, but they have the ability, and I'm going to differ with Reg. For most of the disruption, they do not have to go to a judge. Only if the disruption involves illegal activities do they have to get a warrant. So this authorizes them to do all kinds of things which aren't strictly illegal, but would be very disruptive to activists and their groups. They don't even have to go to a judge for that. And Murray makes the point, if they do go to a judge, there's nobody to represent the other side. It's a fundamental problem to asking for a warrant to disrupt your threats to Canada when you can't say, but I'm defending my rights if you're an Aboriginal person. You can't say, I have my right to free speech. You're not there when that warrant is authorized. And when CSIS goes away and carries out that activity, the difference from the police is the police do that in a criminal context where that warrant ends up back in court. And a judge says, what did you do with the warrant? Was that legal? How did you use the warrant? And if it wasn't, the prosecution fails. With CSIS, that warrant will never come back to court. The purpose of CSIS under this is to disrupt, not to bring criminal charges. So no judge will ever see what happens. And if you follow this carefully, you'll see that CSIS has a very poor record when it applies for warrants in being truthful. And this is the judge's words, that CSIS lacked candor in applying for warrants from judges.
Yeah, I just wanted to say a word about every time it's been raised in Parliament about, pipeline protesters and First Nations and so on, they jump in and say, oh no, we've taken care of that because we have this exemption for lawful advocacy, protest, dissent, and artistic expression. And the point has been made that, lawful protest and all the ambiguity that involves with civil disobedience and so on. But I'd like to raise something else, which is based on the research that I've done in the book that I did on the history of the security service. And there's a long history about this, which is that you go back to the Cold War, and they said, well, we're not really interested in, legitimate trade unions, but we're interested in stopping the communists who are in the trade unions. How do you spy on the communists in the trade unions without spying on the trade unions? So in fact, they end up with tens of thousands of pages of documents based on the spying on all kinds of Canadian, just about every union in the country. And this goes on through the 1970s. In Quebec, they said, we're interested in the violent terrorists, the FLQ, but they ended up spying on the Parti Québécois, a lawful party, a legitimate political party, because they said they might be, the bad guys might be hiding inside the PQ. How do you distinguish it? The G20 protest in Toronto. The problem is that you can use that question of violence, somebody might blow up a pipeline somewhere down the road. So you can spy upon the entire anti-pipeline protest. Yeah.
On Sunday, Tom Mulcair stated on Global that he was open to amending rather than repealing C-51.
Go ahead.
Peter Julian said that you guys would repeal it outright, and I was just wondering, will the NDP as government amend or repeal C-51?
So Global has retracted this story as being in error, but they don't highlight that.
Okay, I saw the interview, and it's the last question at the end, and he wouldn't state outright that he would repeal and that he was open to amendments.
Okay, I have seen the same interview, but I can tell you, and I talked directly with Tom about it afterwards because I started getting calls immediately, and Tom said, no, it was the context that we are committed to repealing this bill. And again, Laurel made reference to the RCMP very shocking memo that creates this whole new category of anti-petroleum activists and just lumps everybody together. Me, you, probably everybody in this room gets lumped into the same category as, and then the next sentence says, and violent extremists. And it's very clear that neither the current commissioner nor the current director of CSIS acts independently of this government.
They've been trying to rush this bill through so quickly and so much in the dark because they don't want people to actually see it. And that includes their own people as well. And, maybe if we can sort of hold this up long enough and bring up these points that, in fact, maybe some of their own support might weaken a little bit.
Is this like the McCarthy era in the 1950s where everybody was a communist and people were worried about Reds under the bed and all of that chill, the kind of chill that Laurel talked about? And I said, at one level it's worse. And the reason it's worse is because rather than the word communist, you now substitute the word terrorist. And if you're on this list, what's worse is that 16 government departments now will get all the information in a technology that did not exist in the 1950s. It's called the internet. And all of a sudden, the information about you is available across the Canadian government with no worries about privacy, and then to other agencies, CIA, etc., across the world. So it's the technology that makes it even more frightening if you think about part one, the information sharing provisions of C-51.